Hello, and welcome to VMware Cloud Foundation webinar series, the Engineers Edition, where we dive into the technology and the use cases. Today's episode is Network Visibility in a VMware Cloud Foundation world. In this episode, we delve into VMware Cloud Foundation Operations for networks, focusing on application discovery, performance optimization, migration, and troubleshooting. We will highlight how VCF enhances visibility, streamlines operation, and ensures seamless transitions in a private cloud environment. I'm Jamie Holbrook, a solutions architect out of Atlanta, Georgia, focused on networking and security. And I'm joined today with my fellow solutions architect, Mike Gringle, out of Seattle, Washington. Hey, Mark, how are things going on the West Coast there?
Well, they're doing well. How you doing, Jimmy?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's not quite as early here for me. Appreciate you joining us this early. Um,
Wait.
Quick little bit of housekeeping. We also have Leslie Harris and Aaron Ramirez helping out with the Q&A. So please use the Q&A section for questions, and we'll answer your questions there, as well as we'll cover some live. So today our guest is Matt Just, a staff technical marketing architect with the VMware Cloud Foundation Division. Hello, Matt. How are things going?
Hey, Jamie, not too bad.
All right, this is an exciting topic. I always love this as we have more and more customers looking to move off of their traditional VMware stack into the VMware Cloud Foundation. And the migration and how do I get there and what's the impact is such a huge concern for a lot of our customers. And I really feel like today we're going to cover a lot of things to really help ease that. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Matt, and we'll kick this thing off.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So hello, everyone. My name is Matt Just. I am a staff technical marketing architect here at VMware by Broadcom. And today, as Jamie mentioned within the webinar, what our primary focus is going to be on today is going to be around VCF operations for networks, which is essentially some of you may have heard previously known as ARIA operations for networks or vRealize Network Insight in the past. But is now actually a feature set within the VCF operations offering within VCF. And we're going to focus on a couple different topics. We're going to talk about network visibility, but more importantly, utilizing network visibility for things like application discovery, understanding what makes up an application, dependency mappings, and so on. And then getting more further into things like how can we take applications as we discover them and migrate them, let's say, into a VCF environment from a non-VCF environment. And then after we migrate them, how can we take those and do day two troubleshooting or optimization and so on. So within VCF network operations, and I'm just going to switch over here to some slides really quick. So within the VCF operations for networks section, I'll just give a quick high-level overview for those that are not familiar with what we have to offer there. So within VCF operations for networks, our primary focus is network operations and network security visibility that we focus on as part of a feature set within VCF operations console itself within VCF. And this allows us to be able to look at our applications and our networking infrastructure, both virtual and physical. And this includes also all like third party. So we're a third party agnostic tool that allows us to have full visibility across our VCF infrastructure, our non-VCF infrastructure, and all of the components that support that infrastructure, both virtually and physically. And that includes everything from routers, switches, load balancers, firewalls. And this gives us, again, that visibility into the private cloud, which essentially is our VCF environment. As I mentioned, the virtualized networking, which could be simply as a virtual distributed switch running in vCenter, or it could be NSX logical switching and logical routing that's running within the NSX infrastructure within VCF. And that gives us deep visibility into VMware Cloud Foundation and also other VMware infrastructure from a virtualization perspective, including things like Kubernetes and non-VCF environments with vCenter and so on. And this allows us to, again, kind of stitch and provides that full visibility. So one of the challenges that we have today, or that we've had for a long time, is bridging the gap between the virtual infrastructure and our physical infrastructure. And that's where we really shine in having VCF operations for networks as a tool set within VCF operations, which allows us to provide that visibility into, as I mentioned, our VCF infrastructure running, our virtual machines, our applications, our containers, and then having all of the connectivity into the virtual networking overlay, whether it be just virtual distributed switches or if NSX is deployed and we're running NSX with logical switching overlay and routing for like P2V, and then extending that visibility into the physical networking elements supporting that VCF infrastructure within the data center, such as our routers, switches, load balancers, and firewalls, so that we can truly understand how those applications are consuming the infrastructure, both virtually and physically, and what are those dependencies. And which is, when I talk dependencies, it's going to be key to understand those dependencies when we look at understanding what makes up an application and how we're going to look at that application from not only just a day two perspective and look at monitoring and managing and providing optimization, but looking at applications that, let's say we deploy a new VCF infrastructure and we want to migrate applications from a non-VCF infrastructure into that VCF infrastructure, the new VCF greenfield infrastructure that we deployed, or it could even be a brownfield VCF infrastructure. And this also could be utilized for things like mergers and acquisitions or data center consolidations and so on. So we can deploy in multiple data centers. So that way we can look at different infrastructures that we're looking even to consolidate. And we need to understand those applications and those dependencies so that we can migrate those applications into our VCF infrastructure that we have deployed without providing or without any type of disruption to our applications in impacting our end users' experiences. And then again, optimizing that post-migration to the VCF infrastructure. So as what I'm going to focus on primarily, like I said, within this webinar is primarily on the assessment piece and the planning, looking at how we can assess our infrastructure, how we can understand what makes up an application, doing the planning, our app curation, and so on. And then we'll also look at the migration piece. So we'll look at how we can actually utilize VCF operations for networks to build out things such as our migration waves and our mobility groups that we can utilize tool sets such as workload mobility, or HCX, which is a component within VCF operations that we can migrate our applications with easily, and not only use that tool set to build out our planning, but also perform the migrations, monitor the migrations, and also monitor the each application's performance as it's being migrated from a live migration state, and then being able to look at that from a pre-migration to a post-migration, and then perform optimization as needed. So just a couple high-level things. So again, within the VCF Operations Console, within VCF Operations for Networks, we focus on both infrastructure-centric and application-centric data sets. So we're looking at everything from, as I mentioned, underlay to overlay to flow visibility, analytics, troubleshooting, utilizing things like machine learning and AI to understand our dependencies and mapping out within our application discovery tool sets, and also within our application migration feature sets. And that's what we're going to dive into. And I'm going to focus more on a live demo, kind of walking through this within the console. And a couple things that we're going to talk about is looking at the application discovery process. So within the application discovery process, we have multiple tool sets that we can utilize depending on how your vCenters are deployed, how your applications are deployed within the app, within your infrastructure. And, everyone has different ways that they manage their applications. So we have, folders, we have tags, we have many different tool sets within the vCenter that could be utilized. that we can use to structure our applications. So within that, we can utilize within VCF operations for networks, different types of ways to actually discover those applications and use tool sets such as machine learning and algorithms and so on with flow visibility to be able to understand those applications better and map out the dependencies within those applications. And then we're going to get into looking at the workload mobility piece. So that's going to get in more into the migration planning. So this is actually a newer feature set that we've introduced within VCF operations for networks recently that allows us to actually take those discovered applications and understand those dependencies and so on that those applications have and be able to map those into migration waves and mobility groups and be able to see what our consumption will be and so on within our VCF infrastructure if we were to migrate those applications and plan out how we're going to migrate those applications to our VCF infrastructure. And then lastly, we'll dive into day two network operations, and that's going to focus on looking at things, different tool sets that we have for network optimization and troubleshooting within our guided network troubleshooting tool set, which is in a component of VCF operations for networks. And that's also going to help us to better understand utilizing more of a mind mapping approach to the constructs and the dependencies for an application or even a member of an application. So we can focus on things such as just an individual virtual machine and dive into those and start dissecting them and looking at each dependency from a host to the flows, to the various services, to the underlying network infrastructure that's being utilized by that virtual machine or that application and in its entirety. And also see things like application peers or member peers, such as other virtual machines that may be running on that same ESXi host within that VCF infrastructure, so that we can do performance comparisons and so on to see if we're seeing any type of cross impact from, let's say, a database to a web tier. Two different virtual machines, and the database is impacting the web virtual machine from an app or from a performance perspective due to, let's say, a large amount of resource consumption due to a backup that may be running. So how we can easily visually map those out and see those and better understand and then optimize the infrastructure. So let's go ahead and switch over to our demo environment. So I'm going to go ahead and switch here.
So while you're switching over, I've got a two-part question for you. So from a requirements perspective, and the two parts is, what is required from the VMware perspective at a vSphere level to get this information so we can make these decisions? And secondly, what does the architecture of the actual VCF operations for network look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jamie. So really quick, what I can do is just touch on that. So within the infrastructure, basically what we utilize from a collection standpoint, and the nice thing is we're totally agentless. So we don't need any type of agents or boxes that are deployed within an infrastructure to collect the data and do everything that we're going to look at today. So we utilize virtual appliances, virtual machines that are going to allow us to collect data. And that infrastructure, the way that we do that, depending on what we're integrating with, and when I say that we refer to them as data sources. So from a data source perspective, that could be a vCenter, that could be an NSX manager, it could be physical router switches, load balancers, and so on. It could be a compute infrastructure that VCF is deployed on, such as, let's say, Cisco UCS as an example, and looking at the UCS manager and the performance of all of the blades and the fabric interconnects. So we can dive into various different components, and we utilize a read-only approach, utilizing what we call a collector appliance or collector virtual machine. And we can have multiple collectors deployed in the infrastructure that allow us to do data collection via flows, also utilizing common tool sets in the industry today, such as API calls, SSH, SNMP, and so on, that allow us to pull specific metrics. And that's all going to be based on vendors and what the vendor makes available to us, whether it's our own VMware products or with third-party products that we can utilize to pull that data without using agents or getting into any type of intrusive data collection mechanisms or methods that are going to impact the performance of any appliance or virtual machine or so on within the infrastructure. And the big thing is again, being able to ingest flows. So supporting things like NetFlow, IPFix, SFlow, and being able to do full flow analysis on a one-to-one perspective gives us a true visibility into what is communicating within the infrastructure. And that is one of the most critical components to have when we're looking at dependencies and application mapping, and even getting into troubleshooting. And then our collector virtual machines actually communicate using a secure tunnel over 443, as we can see, to what we call the platform. And the platform is a separate appliance, which does all of the, basically is the GUI interface that's within VCF operations, and also can be accessed as a separate tool to be able to look at everything that we're going to look at today within the network infrastructure and the application migration planning, the application discovery, and day two ops visibility. And that allows us to pull that data from the collectors. So the collectors do all of the data ingestion. They'll do deduplication, aggregation of all of the data sets, and then send the metadata only to the actual platform. And then the platform is what the end user accesses using a web browser to be able to visualize and work with the data that we're pulling from all of the infrastructure, both virtual and physical. So again, it's an agentless approach that we use, and we work with multi-vendors support, utilizing industry standard protocols that are out there and methods for data collection. So whether it be streaming data bus, whether it be, again, API calls, SSH, SNMP, flow ingestion, and so on, whatever the vendor supports is kind of what we work with, and what they make available to us is how we look at the best way that we can collect data to provide the visibility that our end users and network operations folks need when they're doing analysis, depending on what function that they're looking to perform. So whether it's, again, application discovery, migration, troubleshooting, and so on.
Okay, so as a quick summary from a VMware vSphere perspective, obviously NetFlow is important, and the only way we're getting that out of vSphere is through a distributed switch. So just make sure if you're running standard switches, you need to enable the vSphere distributed switch to support the IPFix NetFlow. And then from the deployment model, we have the concept of collectors that you can deploy as necessary to ingest the NetFlow data and information from your physical infrastructure, and then your platform, which is typically, I guess, would be a cluster nowadays, to handle all the front end and analytics of operation networks.
Absolutely.
And,
yep. So,
and I think, Mark, did you also have?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I got a couple questions. The first is somebody asked about resiliency of the platform. How do we provide any type of resiliency, both for the data center and even pulling in, say, edge locations?
Yeah, so I meant there's different ways that we can support that. So we utilize different tool sets within the being the key thing is being a virtual appliance based solution. It allows us to utilize different tools such as like vSphere HA or vCenter high availability. Being able to utilize various different methods. So we actually utilize a data replication that goes across multiple platforms. So we actually call those a platform cluster. So we can form clusters that allows us to replicate the data across multiple platforms. The collectors can be deployed both within a individual data center They can pull data across a VPN or multiple connections, or they can actually be deployed in a separate data center and send the data back to the platform that is in a centralized data center, to say. So, and the nice thing about doing that is allowing us to have those collectors in the remote data centers or the other data centers within our infrastructure, is that it does all of the data collection, the deduplication, aggregation, and basically reduces the data set down to a metadata that we're sending back to the platform by almost about 70%. So roughly of all that data that we're collecting, we're not sending all the flows and we're not sending all that metadata over to the actual platform directly across a data center interconnect, as an example. So we're actually taking that data and we're consolidating and keeping that locally on the collector VM within a local database on the collector VM, and then sending the metadata from the aggregated data and such as like flow deduplication and so on that we perform on the actual collector itself, and sending that to the platform via a secure connection over the data center interconnect. So it really reduces the amount of resources from a network perspective as far as sending all that data from one data center to the other. And then the nice thing is, if a connection between those actually goes down, the appliances themselves will continue to collect data locally on the appliances. So when I say the appliances, the virtual machines, and then once the connection is restored, it will upload all of that data to the actual platform, as an example. So we do have redundancy there in regards to having disconnects between a collector and a platform, where the collectors will run their own database to store data and then update the platform so that we don't lose any of that data from a visibility perspective.
And then one other question, Matt. What type of performance hit do we expect on the vSphere host when we start pulling this flow data? Is it something that we need to worry about, or is it pretty minimal?
To be honest with you, it's very minimal. So because we use the concept of distributed switches, or within NSX, you have like distributed firewalls that can provide flow data and so on. Using a distributed model across each one of the hosts, when we enable IPFix or NetFlow on those hosts to collect data, it is actually using a distributed model. And so when we're looking at that and we're ingesting that flows that are coming from each one of those hosts to the collector appliances or the collector VMs, depending on how many we have deployed, and that's going to be based on the size of the infrastructure, number of virtual machines, and so on, or data centers, then it is a basically from we've tested this and we have customers running this in very large infrastructures, over hundreds of thousands of virtual machines with their infrastructures, and seeing a minimal impact of less than 0.5% of CPU memory resources from a consumption perspective, just by enabling the NetFlow IPFix within those hosts.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. And then lastly, just before I switch back over to the demo environment, the one thing I want to touch on is, I did mention, we work with a lot of different integrators and so on, a lot of different vendors out there. So this is just kind of a quick list of some of the vendors, both, not only just VMware, but we work with all the major partners out there, such as Cisco and Dell and Arista and all the major players. And we even also support running, obviously you can run VCF on hypervisors, so such as VMware Cloud on AWS, AVS, Google Cloud, VMware Engine, and so on. So the various solutions, we can provide visibility and also the same type of what we're going to talk about: application discovery and application migration, day two optimization, troubleshooting. All of that can be performed across both VMware or VCF Cloud on AWS or multiple hyperscalers, our VCF infrastructure, including our Kubernetes environments, and not just VMware Kubernetes environments, but we can also support things such as Red Hat, OpenShift, and just vanilla Kubernetes. And then getting into also from a physical and virtual infrastructure standpoint across the network and security platforms, we have deep integrations with multiple vendors out there today. So let me go ahead and switch over to our environment here. And just confirm, team, that we can see the network console here.
We've got you. Looks good.
Great. So within VCF Operations for Networks, and you can see I'm just logged in here using a web browser. And I'm not going to get into all logistics, but basically every end user can log in and have their own customization. These are all, using HTML5 and so on. We can customize our dashboards and map these out and have them so that each end user, based on their job role and so on, or the data set that they want to function, or that they're looking at on a daily basis, can have customized dashboards and so on. And that's essentially what these pins are. So, we refer to these as widgets, and we can actually pin these to separate dashboards and build out our own custom dashboards based on specific data that we want to focus on. So diving into, let's start off with a couple things. One, once we get the appliances deployed and we start collecting data from, let's say, our vCenters and so on, or it could be from non-VCF or from VCF infrastructure. And we're looking at things like, as we can see here, currently in this lab environment, I've got 2 vCenters that are deployed, a management, and then I've got one that's for my infrastructure, for my compute. And then I do have 2 NSX managers deployed in here also. So I can see the 2 different sets of data sources that I've added from an environment perspective. And I can highlight over these and see things like the status, whether we're using we kind of use like a typical temperature, looking at from a green to a yellow to a red, depending on if there's any problems detected. We can see within our vCenters, we can see how many VMs are deployed. We can see how many hosts are being utilized and so on across each one of these. And then same thing within like NSX. So I can see my host transport nodes look good, but let's say my management nodes right now are reporting a critical problem and some other problems. So I can click into these to go and start doing troubleshooting and take a look at what's going on there. And some of that may be just because if it's a fresh deployment, we're also doing monitoring to alert you on as you're deploying the infrastructure, if we see things that are against best practice, to say, let's say, incorrect MTU settings and so on, that we're seeing. We'll alert you to that and show you where those are at so that you can correct those as you're deploying an infrastructure such as like NSX within VCF. So it becomes very useful there. And then we also have all our other insights. So we can see things like if we have any type of how many VMs are talking to the internet, firewall rule hits, applications with unprotected flows. We get a quick hit dashboard that allows us to see anomalies such as different virtual machines, the segments, whether they're on, and we refer to L2 segments either as a VLAN, or if NSX is deployed, it could be a logical switch. So that's what we're seeing here. So I can see VLAN 111 on just a standard virtual distributed switch. And then I can also see on this application, the database tier, this virtual machine is actually connected to a logical segment, an L2 segment in NSX, and that's referring to the name of that actual segment. And then it's also showing me data sets as to if I'm seeing drop packets. So in this case here, I can see where we have different amounts of packets being dropped for this virtual machine that are triggering a anomaly right here on our main dashboard that I can click into this virtual machine and start troubleshooting and taking a looking at why we're having drop packets occurring specifically on this database. And then as we go further in, we can get into different types of data sets that we can look at. But the key things I want to focus on here within today's webinar is going to be around starting off with our application. So a lot of people ask, how do we understand what makes up an application within our infrastructure? And what are those dependencies of those applications? And that's probably one of the biggest challenges, especially if you've got an older infrastructure, older applications, I guess I should say, that were maybe developed 15, 20 years ago, that the developers are no longer around, and you don't know every single dependency that application may have. We can map things out pretty good in a CMDB, like ServiceNow and so on, and have a pretty good understanding. But utilizing flow and machine learning, flow analysis and machine learning, we can better help discover those applications and understand in those applications things like what makes up the application, what type of dependencies, how many servers are communicating, what ports, is it using DNS, NTP, so on. So we have many different ways that we can do analysis there. And then we can monitor those applications after we've discovered them. So if we click on add applications here, we have various different ways that we can add applications. One of the probably the most powerful ways that the tool set allows us to discover applications is utilizing flow visibility and machine learning to detect applications and discover applications. So what this does is because we're doing one-to-one flow analysis, we can see every communication that occurs, and this can be from just daily communication, or it could be a one-time, let's say, script that runs once a month that is just a brief period update, that may be hitting another server that we may not be aware of that occurs at a specific time, like overnight as an example. We're going to detect all of that, and that allows us to truly map out those dependencies. And we can come in and we can choose different ways that we want to utilize the flows and scope those for discovery. So we can come in and we can choose, our scope, such as all flows, or we can actually come in and choose entities. So if I want to focus on just like a cluster or a data center or a folder, we have many different constructs that we can choose, as you can see here, depending on what I'm looking to do from an application discovery perspective. So I can start from an entire, from a data center perspective down to a cluster or a vCenter as an example. Or I can just come in and just say, you know what, I want to run this across my whole infrastructure that I'm monitoring. And that's based on the data sources, again, that I've added. And I'm going to run this, and it's going to look at, and I can choose how long of flows do I want to look at. So I'm going to do 30 days to make sure I have a good data set collection that is going to allow us to be able to see the flows across the last 30 days. And then I can come in and choose my discovery options. So a couple things that we've done based on customer feedback is, let's say I want to utilize a CSV or a export from a CMDB, such as ServiceNow or other CMDBs that are out there. And I want to upload that as a CSV file so that when it's running the application discovery and analyzing those flows, it can better map and utilize the existing naming infrastructure that I as a customer may be familiar with within how I've named my applications versus what's in vCenter as the names of the virtual machines that make up those applications. So this allows us to download it. We can download a sample CSV file that we can manually manipulate, or we can take an exported one and ingest that so we can browse and upload that, so that when the flow-based application discovery is running, it will run, and as it discovers various different VMs, it'll make sure that it maps it to the application name that you want to utilize, rather than a suggested name based on things, let's say, by VM names or tags and so on. And we'll talk about that here in a second. And then lastly, we can also choose what types of entities and so on, or what types of things that we want to look at as the flow-based application discovery is running. So as an example, I can choose and I can move these into different orders. So I can use, VM names. I can click and drag these in which order I want to utilize. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to use things like security groups, tags, VM names, the uploaded CSV file, load balancers, and also VM tags. So we have, security tags and VM tags. And this will allow us to utilize these different constructs to be able to choose how we want to discover our applications utilizing the AI technologies and the machine learning across that flow analysis. So security groups, tags, and we can choose in which order we want those detected. So let's just say for this, I want to use VM names. I'm going to use security groups. I'm going to use security tags. I'm not going to upload a CSV. I don't have any load balancers right now. It says load balancers not found. So if I wanted to add load balancers like an F5 load balancer or NSX load balancers, I can enable this, and it will use like things like the load balancing pools and so on to better help discover and map out those applications utilizing the algorithms. And then same thing with VM tags. And then once I'm done, I hit submit, and it's going to then start discovering application utilizing flows. And once it starts doing that, it's going to then start showing us different applications that it's going to find within the infrastructure. And this will run, and you can leave this running, you can pause it, you can stop it. But the nice thing is as it's running, it will also detect, even after you save the applications within your infrastructure, any type of application changes. So if we're detect any new discovery of, let's say, new members that are added to the applications, or any type of change that's been done, let's say we remove a virtual machine and we replaced it with container services and so on, we have that capability of alerting and showing what changed, and you can come in and you can accept that change manually or automatically, and it will automatically update the application view within the application dashboard. In an example here, as it's starting to go through and start discovering applications, so I just turned this on. What it's doing is it's looking at the flows, and it's going to use a confidence level system where it's going to go from a low to a medium to a high. And then it's going to start creating things such as the tiers. So it's going to start breaking them out. And the way that it names these tiers is going to be based off of the way that I chose in my discovery profile. So I came in and I said, I want to use VM names first. So it's going to start using the VM names, and it's going to start naming those tiers. It's going to group those VMs automatically within those tiers. And then it's also going to show me the names of those tier or VMs or members, so we can see each one. So in the web tier, we can see OC-web-0078, which is a virtual machine, has automatically been placed within the web tier. So as you can see here, it's going to intelligently map these out across each one and start populating tiers. And that's all based on flow analysis and machine learning algorithms that we're running to do on those to be able to determine what makes up an application. And then I can there click and save that application into my application dashboard. I also can utilize different attributes. Yep.
There's something that jumps out to me that's pretty impressive here. It's two things that you kind of called out. As one, this is dynamic. So like you talked about, we try to capture all the different events, but think about maybe a one time a year, Black Friday sales event, or in the utility space where maybe there's power outages. And so you got to rapidly scale out particular parts of an application. That's kind of nice to see that this will be dynamic and pick up those changes. And the CSV thing, I think that's a huge thing, because how many times do our app owners tell us, "Oh, you don't need to discover. I know what my app is," and they have it in their file. What I love about this is that you can use it to help name it, but you can also show where there's discrepancy, where they didn't remove machines out of an application or didn't add ones in. I think that's kind of cool how it will let you know when the CSV is different from what it actually discovered. But it's pretty powerful stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So even when we upload a CSV file and we're running the application discovery against that, that'll also tell us that if it's detecting any discrepancies and so on, and call those out and let us know if, hey, you should add this virtual machine as a dependency, or you should remove this one, and this is why. So we have different dynamic tools and visibility that we can utilize. And again, depending on the application, depending on the use case, can be very powerful in help scaling out, both from an application perspective and even from an optimization perspective, from a day two perspective, for those types of events, like you said, like a Black Friday sale or something that may be driving a lot of traffic and triggering additional data sets that we need to better understand, and then utilize that to dynamically expand. So absolutely. And then, so just to, really quickly here, the other couple different ways that we can discover applications is we can utilize different attributes. So we can use VM attributes, and we can come in and we can choose things like utilizing expressions. So we can come in and utilize regular expression. So I can come in and actually build out a pattern. So I can choose, like, let's say an example of an existing virtual machine. So if I choose this virtual machine, it's going to automatically build out the position and grouping for me of the virtual machine. And just by choosing specific positions, or let's say I choose the entire group, it's going to show me the regular expression here, which I can see up here. And it's also going to help me find similar applications and map out applications just based off of that regular expression. So if you like to work with regular expressions, or you have a lot of applications that are very similar named from a name set perspective, this really comes in handy when you're doing application discovery. And then you can even get into running advanced regular expression, across using different things such as tags and groups and many other different types of data sets. We do support CMDB integration. So like for ServiceNow as an example, I don't have a ServiceNow instance deployed right now, but you can come in and you can add ServiceNow as a data source, and you can ingest the CMDB, and we can run the flow-based application discovery against that and actually utilize that. A lot of customers utilize that to true up their CMDBs when they're doing analysis and they want to see utilizing flow data and true communication to better enhance and update that CMDB, let's say within ServiceNow. And then we can also come in and just add applications manually. So if I'm just building out an environment, or I just want to come in and type in an application name, type in a name of a tier. Let's say I want to do web tier. I can come in and I can utilize different properties to add virtual machines or physical IPs or Kubernetes services. So we can see over here the VMs, the IPs, and the services. So I can choose, let's say I want to do a VM, and I can click and it'll bring up suggestive search, and it's going to show me things like what is the vendor, the IP address, both IPv6 and IPv4, which is important to call out that we do have visibility there in both. And I can start adding virtual machines. So on the web tier, let's say I know I've got some various different webs, so OC dash, and if I start typing in web, it's going to start showing me suggestive VMs that I can utilize to add if I wanted to, let's say, add this virtual machine within the web tier that I'm creating within this specific application. And then I can click add another tier. And I can do the same thing with like a database and, go in again, choose, it could be a physical database with an IP address, it could be services, it could be a virtual, a SQL database running on a virtual machine. So again, I can hit OC and I can see I've already got some databases here popping up, but I can specify specifically utilizing either names or regular expression patterns to build out and add multiple members to this tier. And then I can also add additional conditions if I wanted to. So let's say it's a VM, and then I can add another condition with an IP address and specify either an IPv4 or an IPv6 or a specific CIDR that I want specifically for that tier, and add those in.
Hey, Matt,
And, yep.
Quick question. What if I have parts of my application residing on compute that's not virtualized? In other words, it's not a VM, it's a bare metal server, for instance, that is, I don't know, a web server or something. Can we still add that into this tool?
Yeah, we could. So utilizing applications that's running, let's say, on a bare metal. So because we utilize flow ingestion, what that allows us to do is, let's say I want to take a bare metal application. So first of all, a couple different things. When you have a bare metal application, or let's say I've got a database that's running on bare metal, it's going to be, in a lot of cases, communicating with the virtual infrastructure. So because we have full flow visibility coming in and out of, let's say, it's starting off, let's talk about the virtual infrastructure. So if an app tier or a web tier based VM is communicating with, let's say, a bare metal database, we're going to see that communication, excuse me, one way or the other, because incoming and outgoing, because that's going to be going from that database and communicating with that virtual machine. So, let's say an application is partially virtualized and partially utilizing, let's say, as I mentioned, a bare metal database. We already have that flow visibility. Now, if I'm running an infrastructure that is strictly just all bare metal applications and I want to look at that, we can also add in things like such as, because of the support of all the different vendors that we have for switching and routing infrastructures, we can add in the top rack switch that those bare metal servers are connected to. And then we can start ingesting the NetFlow or the IPFix or the S-Flow, depending on the vendor, from those switches, and we can utilize that to map out application communication and so on, because we can do it all, all the way down from to a port level visibility. So that allows us also to have capabilities of pulling that in. And again, that's where things like IP addresses come in. So I can specify a bare metal application or a server IP address that I want to add as a member of the application, or it can be automatically discovered utilizing things like flow-based application discovery, just based off the communication from, let's say, a VM that is part of the application that's communicating with that bare metal database. I can it's automatically going to detect that IP address and let me know, that, hey, this is a dependency. We need to add this in, or we're going to add this in. And then I can come in, you can name it. We do support utilizing, DNS and so on. So if you're running things like info blocks or anything like that, you can ingest DNS mappings to IPv4 and IPv6 and so on. So if you want to see the names or the IP addresses, depending on how you want to do that, and then you can do some customization once it's set up and configured within the product. So yes, we can absolutely, to answer your question, support both virtual and bare metal applications.
That's really nice, because in many cases I have these applications that are on bare metal and I want to potentially virtualize those or secure them or even move them to, VMC and AWS or one of our public clouds. And so,
Yep.
it's fully integrated into all these third-party systems that could provide this flow information. And of course, we could use that to do this application profiling. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah. And so, and then once we have our applications and we start discovering those, we're going to we can monitor those within the application dashboard. So we can come in and we can see how many applications we've got deployed in different infrastructures. We're going to look in, like, as I mentioned, we look for application changes. We look for membership updates or newly discovered members or newly discovered applications. And those are going to indicate by a number that we can, as they're being detected, that you can click on with a dynamic link. There'll be one of these links here, but it will say, just like we have number 39 here, I can click on it and it's going to tell me what those membership updates are. And then we're also going to have a quick overview of, our top 25 applications, and we can come through and we can filter by, let's say, like talking to the internet. Now I've just added just one application so far. I also can look at, by incoming traffic and so on. And it's going to show me any types of changes that have occurred. So incoming traffic has increased by 125.9% here. And when I look at this, I can start looking at where the increased traffic is occurring within this application. But let's say I wanted to look at that application just from the dashboard here. So I can click on the application, I can click on view dashboard for that application, and it's now going to move me into the actual application dashboard. And this is where it's going to provide me with that oversight for this application. This one's called MOAD VCF-NSX. And it's showing me an overview of the application right now, currently on the infrastructure that it's currently deployed on, such as incoming traffic, outgoing traffic, how many total flows are occurring, any intents that are running against that. And we'll get into that in another webinar. We can also look at like GeoIP lookup, so we can actually see which countries there's interaction, how many flows, and so on. So this comes into key from understanding where we do have communication coming from, in or out, and also can come into play from a security play. And then we can also see what makes up the application. So in this case, this is three virtual machines make up this application. There's no physical IPs or Kubernetes services that are members of this application. And then it maps these out for us and starts showing us data sets such as the tiers. So the database tier, I've got a single virtual machine. The web tier, I've got two different virtual machines within them. And then we also have the communication. So everything you see here is showing communication to maybe other applications or other entities, shared physical resources. So when I click on, let's say, the database here, it's going to, on this line, will show me the flows that are going to, give it a second here. I think my internet's running a little slow. So what this is actually showing me here is from the DB to the shared. I can see from the database, I've got DNS connectivity. So to my DNS server, I've got one flow that's currently going to this DNS server, and I can see how much traffic. And then if I wanted to dive into the flow and do analytics and so on, I can absolutely do that. So it maps out all the communication that's occurring between the individual members within the tiers, whether it's going to the internet, to shared physical, to other resources, between tiers, and so on. And we can get into utilizing a lot of different powerful tool sets, and it's already providing alerts for me. We're looking at everything from, hey, did a vMotion occur? Did a VM move from one host to another, which is important to know. Has there been any type of configuration changes? So I can see if a VM has been added or deleted on a specific host that the application is utilizing. So we're tracking many different types of data sets and providing alerts based on the severity, and then also showing you the members that that actually are responsible for managing the application. So in this case, this application is running and being managed by an individual vCenter. So it's showing me the vCenter here, and I can look at details, and then I can also see any type of alerts that may be popping up. So I've got flow collection disabled on some port groups that have NSXT edges connected to them. So it's giving me more of a best practice alert that I can utilize and look at that alert and see where that's occurring and look at the recommendation to resolve that issue. So many different data sets that we can use there. But before we get into, diving into that, let's take a look at and say, I want to take this application and I want to, this is running, I've detected this application, I discovered it, I've let this run long enough where, I've collected enough flow data. It's ran the algorithms, it understands the dependencies. So now I want to move this into my VCF infrastructure. So I could have, and let's say this application is running on a non-VCF infrastructure currently today, or it could even be in another data center that I'm moving to a data center that is running all VCF. So what I can then do is I can say, let's go in and start looking at how can we plan out migrations. So that allows us to come in and click on plan and assess, and we have migration planning here, which I can click on the migration planning. And what it will allow us to do is I can see existing plans that are already here, or I can come in and I can do create plan, and I can say, let's say DC, just for make this simple, DCA to VCI as an example. And then I can also put in a description of, any types of details of what this plan is entailing or what my intentions are with this plan. And then I click on proceed. And then it's going to populate us into the scoping. So this is the first step, is going to be to define our scope. And because we have the capability of, discovering the applications, but also utilizing things like cluster visibility, tag visibility, ESXi host visibility, vCenters, all those different types of constructs that I talked about, different data centers and so on, different vCenters, we can choose on how we want to scope out a migration plan. Now, I've already discovered some applications, so I'm just going to pick on an application here. So we'll look at this MOAD VCF NSX application, and we can see when I click on the application over here, it has 3 members that make up that application. So it's got 2 web virtual machines and a database virtual machine. And then it also is showing us the name of the application, what clusters those VMs belong to. It's showing us any tags, so I can see the different tags that are tied to each one of the virtual machines, which ESXi hosts those virtual machines live on. So this is ESX 03, 03, and the database is on 02, the data center, and then it's also giving us the vCenter managers. And those could be various, depending on the application and how it's structured, could be multiple different vCenters and so on. So I take these virtual machines, I can click on them, and I can say, okay, I want to add these to scope. I'm going to move the entire application. So now they've disappeared from available, and now when I click on in scope, I can now see the virtual machines that I've moved into the scope. And I can also click on network dependencies. And what this is going to do is show me the network dependencies, both for out of scope and in scope, that I need to take into consideration. And this is where we're looking at those dependencies. So again, what I can see here is my in scope virtual machines, and I can see my out of scope virtual machines and IP addresses. And that is looking at such as like this web virtual machine is communicating with my with a log server or log insight as an example. I can see different types of communication that's occurring that I'm not including in the scope. So these are management tools that are monitoring these members. And because this is, I'm going to move these from, let's say, a data center to a new data center that is running VCF. I'm not as concerned about them communicating to the old management tools. But I can also see things like the physical IP. So as Jamie called out, or Mark called out, what if we're talking to a bare metal application or a bare metal database and so on? An example. So let's say this was a bare metal database. It's going to show me the IP addresses and so on. So I can take a look at those and determine, are those something that should be in scope or should not be in scope? A lot of customers, may want to run a centralized database and have those not be as part of the scope of the application, but just be a centralized entity as itself. So that may be a reason why we have this out of scope, and we're going to set up communication to that database post migration. Now, so we can see all this type of data sets. We can see total traffic and traffic rates and so on. So this also helps understand what type of resource consumption that we're going to consume across the network as we migrate, and also what we're going to consume as we move this application to our new VCF infrastructure. So far, it's showing me the total scope. It's showing me how much memory, how many cores, how much storage, and so on. And it hasn't detected any VM changes, and we haven't built out any migration waves or mobility groups. So the next step that I'd want to do in this, so I have my in-scope virtual machines, would be to, let's say, build out a migration wave. And I can say, you know what, I want to move the whole app. I'm just going to do it in one wave. I can do that. Or I can come in and say, you know what, I'm just going to move the web tier as a wave to start. So I can come in and I can take these. And once I select these, I can then create my migration waves. So when we go to our migration waves, let me click on that. So when we go into migration waves, now I've defined my scope. I've chose which applications I want to, or which application I'm going to migrate. Give us a second here. My internet's running really slow.
Did you not pay the demo guides this morning? Yeah.
That's either that or we got a lot of consumption right now. Yeah.
So Matt, while we're waiting, we are getting close to the top of the hour. Just as a recap, this is amazing. So we've done a lot of day zero operations, application mapping. We've shown how once they're discovered, we can do troubleshooting around that application, and then creating these migration waves that can be ingested into something like HCX to actually perform the migration. Definitely I want to call out some other things we can do, like assessments, day two operations. I definitely feel like we probably need to have another session where we really dive into what does this look like after we complete the migration, and some additional tools around assessments so that we can even get smarter around how we can leverage virtual networking, for example. That's a new assessment that's really cool, as well as security planning. So as we're hitting the top of the hour, is there any last thing you want to highlight and cover? Because this is cool, this new migration thing, because this is very powerful, because so many customers don't know what impact it's going to be to move off. And so they just migrate a host and don't know what it does to the VM. And so you show now that you can see it from an application lens. And is this application spread across host and clusters? But yeah, any last comments?
Yeah, no, like exactly what you're saying. There's a lot of data to, and a lot of feature sets within VCF operations for networks that, to really try to cover it all in 1 hour is tough. So, I think we've done a good job on understanding that we do have the capabilities, obviously from an infrastructure standpoint of understanding applications, understanding those dependencies, getting into then taking those applications that we've discovered and start populating our and building out our migration plans. And then, from that, getting into more of a day two ops into a visibility, whether we're doing troubleshooting or optimization or just best practice implementation monitoring and so on, and many other different feature sets that we support within the tool set. But I definitely think, yeah, we should probably set up another webinar extending this and look at, furthering on the capability of the migration wave, or building out the migration planning and the mobility, and then looking at what an application looks like after it's been migrated, and looking at it from a performance perspective and optimization perspective, utilizing some of the tool sets that we have within VCF operations for networks. Like I said, based on the amount of time that we've had today and a lot of the questions that we've had and the amount of data to cover, I think this would be a good stopping point as we go, and then we can follow up with a follow-up session and kind of continue where we left off from a migration planning perspective, and then dive into the optimization components.
So excellent. So this will definitely be a to be continued. And when we post this on YouTube, we'll make sure we label this as part one, and then we'll have a part two follow up. Probably, maybe we'll get through the new year. We'll probably look at a January or later time frame. But as always, man, I always learn something new when you're here, Matt. I mean, Mark, this was a great session. Any last thoughts or comments?
No, I think this is exactly I think what people were asking to hear about, because moving these applications into VCF is not necessarily a trivial thing. And as a network admin, I really don't know where these applications are, how they're communicating, what ports and protocols are being used, and it's always a mystery, right? And to actually get this information in a single tool in a matter of minutes is kind of mind blowing. So
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Yeah, very powerful. One quick question on this migration piece. I see this execute migration. How does that actually, just the 30-second kind of, how does that actually work under the covers, and what other tool is used, or what other application is used to actually execute the migration?
Yeah, so once we've actually built out the migration waves and the mobility groups and so on, we can actually take these and utilize the work mobility tool sets such as HCX, which is a VCF component, and implement these migration waves and mobility groups and populate them within HCX, and then start doing the actual migrations themselves. So then we can choose in HCX how we want to migrate them once we have the plans built out and implemented, and then we can then start performing our migration. And then beyond that, we can come back into and look at within VCF operations for networks, we can actually look at the HCX infrastructure, how it's performing during those migrations, and how those actual applications are performing over those HCX L2 tunnel extensions and so on, as they're being migrated from, let's say, data center to data center, or from a non-VCF to a VCF infrastructure, as an example, or even
No, that's
a
super helpful. Yeah. And
yeah,
as we
or
move, say, in your example, moving just the web servers, right? I want to know what type of bandwidth and
yep,
utilization on the network I have. And, this tool just pinpoint exactly what that application is, how much extra traffic is going to go over my my WAN, or my links, and be able to do capacity planning from that.
absolutely. Yep, and we can get into all of that, and we can follow up with that on our follow up part two session that we do.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thanks, Matt. That was great.
Yep. Thank you. So, in closing, for all that are still left with us, thank you for going a little bit over. If you have any questions, please reach out to your local sales team. We talked about there are assessment capabilities within this tool set that we're happy to assist with. And then, like we said, to be continued. We will bring this back up in 2025 and have Matt come on and take us through the rest of the journey for day two. And thanks again, all.
Absolutely.
Have a good day.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Thanks for joining.